Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Mary Ronner from REL West at West Ed, where I focus on equitable post-secondary access and completion and emphasize cross-sector partnerships and college promise programs. I'm joined today by three REL West colleagues, Thomas Torrey Gibney, Francis Reed, and Melissa Josue. Thomas Torrey Gibney focuses on the intersection of K-12 and higher education policies that strengthen student transitions to college and career, and he was the lead researcher on the report that we're going to be presenting today. Francis Reed focuses on both formative and summative evaluations, and she's an expert writer for a wide range of documents for dissemination and a stellar program manager. Melissa Josue specializes in dissemination and digital communication strategy, including e-newsletter production, blog administration, and social media marketing. And we at REL West are honored to be joined today by our two partners from the Arizona Department of Education, Amanda Nolasco and Andrea Glenn. Amanda Nolasco is currently the state's school counselor specialist. And this is a position that's comparable to student services or program specialist in other states. In the 20 years that she's been in the field of education, she's also served as a school counselor, an English teacher and department chair, and a CTE counselor lead. Andrea Glenn is the Arizona Department of Education's post-secondary coordinator. She comes to this position with experience as a Teach for America teacher, the manager for AmeriCorps at Public Allies Arizona, and a college-going counselor at the Phoenix Collegiate Academy ASU Prep South in Phoenix. So a bit about the Regional Education Laboratory West, or REL West. We're one of 10 regional labs in the country that's funded by the Institute of Education Sciences. And our overarching goal is to promote the use of data and research evidence to inform policy and practice. In doing that, we work with educators and policymakers to support evidence-based education systems. Next slide. One of our REL West projects is the study that we're going to be sharing with you today. During this webinar, we hope that you'll understand the study findings on the relationship between high school education and career planning and college-going behaviors, that you'll be able to identify ways to use data from the study to reflect upon adult supports for education and career planning in schools, and to use this to inform your program decision-making, and to exchange ideas about using the study findings to inform your education and career planning work. So now I'll pass this over to Francis Reed.
And here's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to start with just a very quick introductory breakout just to get people talking to each other. Then we will hear a little bit of background on how Arizona is using education and career action plan and the background and history of that work. Then we'll actually hear about the study of, that's a national study of school and student characteristics and college-going behaviors. Then we're going to have a Q&A with all of the presenters from the Arizona Department of Education and REL West. Then we'll have another small group conversation where you can talk about your own work in this area. We'll have a quick meetup with the whole group again to see what surfaced in those small groups, and then we will send you off. So let's go ahead and get started on those breakouts. So now we're going to hear from Amanda Nolasco and Andrea Glenn from the Arizona Department of Education, a little bit about the history and background of their work with education and career action planning. So take it away, Amanda and Andrea.
Thank you. Can we go to the next slide? So just wanting to set the stage here and give you guys a little bit of the background of the statewide college obtainment goal that Arizona has subscribed to. So back in 2018, a group called Achieve 60AZ, under the umbrella of Forward Education Arizona, formerly known as College Success Arizona, got together and strategically wrote a pledge that by 2030, 60% of Arizona's adult population will have a degree or a certificate. Currently in Arizona, only 42% of adults have an education beyond high school. However, in less than 5 years, 70% of the jobs will require an education beyond high school. So knowing this, and to that end, this group of 60 members between our community, business, philanthropic, and education organizations throughout Arizona formed the alliance called Achieve 60 AZ to make the goal that by 2030, 60% of our adults ages 25 to 65 will have a professional certificate or a college degree. Next slide. Also just wanted to kind of quickly go over that the Department of Arizona, or the Department of Education in Arizona, defines our education and career action plan as both a process and a product. So there's two parts to this. The process helps the students integrate their academics with career development opportunities. And the product that's turned into us is created and maintained to document and support these activities. We want to make sure that our LEAs are aware that it's both a process and a product. Sometimes we find that they might get caught up in more of that product and the mandate, but the process is where we feel like really is what grows the culture of college and career going around their campuses. I'm going to turn it over to Amanda.
Great, thank you, Andrea. And I'm so honored to present with Andrea today and the work that we can collaborate together towards this. And I also would be remiss if I didn't mention and say hello to Kay Schreiber, who is on the call, who previously had my position here at the department and really was a champion of a lot of this work for the 14 years that she was at the department. So Kay, I know you're probably going to be angry that I did that, but I just want to say thank you for all of this work that you did. And we're just hoping to continue some of that work that you did. With our ECAPs here in Arizona, which is what we call them, and Andrea, thank you for that idea of presenting the process and the product. Is one thing we know is this is happening every day, all day in our schools. We're having conversations constantly with our students regarding what they need to do in high school to be successful after, the planning they need to do, and all of those components that are wrapped around the ECAP, which include their academic achievements, their career planning, their post-secondary planning, and documentation of extracurricular activities. So by systemically trying to support these students in those 4 areas, and in Arizona that legally must begin in 9th grade, although we know it's strongly encouraged to begin even younger than that in the middle schools. We hope that students will take control of their learning and really focus on what it is that they need to do to be successful. And this happens, we know, through the support of school counselors, teachers, clubs, organizations, outside agencies. This is not a one-person show on a campus. It's a campus-wide initiative wrapping around students to support them in this process to ensure that they know about all of their options. And somebody in our breakout group discussed that as, you know, the best way to guide and direct students to what they want to do. And part of that is allowing students the space and opportunity to learn about those options. As students only know what's in front of them, we need to make sure that we're providing that space for them to research, learn, not only about jobs, careers, and college opportunities, but who they are as a person, to make sure that those individual needs and their knowledge, skills, attitudes, and abilities fit whatever that long-term goal is and the plan to get there. And so this happens through the work of the ECAP with our students, in which we believe in early planning, adult support, and an annual review of this process. So in Arizona, the mandate states that it must begin in 9th grade with at least an annual review by parents for them to catch up on what their students are interested in. But again, as Andrea discussed about, this is a process, and we know that we are working with our students through these conversations every day through classroom guidance lessons, school-wide initiatives, small group counseling, and individual academic planning that happens. Next slide, please. And so the theory of action that Arizona has kind of taken its stance on, or what they believe, is that if we establish a policy that students have to have this ECAP, then we developed guidance back in 2008 to support this work. Very loose guidance, so schools have a lot of autonomy and districts have a lot of autonomy in the delivery and the implementation of what the ECAP looks like, but at the same point giving some structure and guidance to the process as a whole. And so in this hope, like I had just discussed, students are exposed to multiple opportunities and options that they have for after high school and what they need to do in high school to get there. Our hope is that they will then have a plan for when they exit. They are more confident in what they want to do, and that they're not struggling once they leave high school for their purpose or their next plan. And then with that, our goal is that more students are enrolling in post-secondary options, whether that's 2-year, 4-year, trade school, certificate program, apprenticeship, military, but that there is a set plan for when they leave high school. And that all happens with wraparound services within the school, provided by school counselors, teachers, other support staff. And again, we could not do this work in Arizona without our community partners as well, including business and industry, as well as our nonprofit partners that do a lot of support work in the tier 2 and tier 3 areas, as school counselors and teachers support in tier 1. And so we're just very grateful to be here today to just give a little bit of background on the work in Arizona, and excited for you guys to hear the findings that Rail West has come up with, and how this can then improve our work in Arizona as we move forward with ECAP in the next 1 year, 5 year, 10 years, and how it shapes our students here in Arizona. And so these are the questions that were posed by ADE that were a catalyst for the study, in terms of when students do participate in ECAP during high school, does it influence their overall college going behaviors and attitudes? And so can we learn about this influence through these 3 ECAP elements of starting it in 9th grade, making sure they have an adult that provides support for them, and how it looks like when they review that plan annually. And so we're excited for them to share the findings of that study today. And I'm going to turn it over to Thomas.
All right, thank you, Amanda. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And special thanks to Amanda and Andrea for setting the stage for the research that I'm going to present now. So what you'll hear over the next 20 minutes or so is a summary of the main findings from our study, which, as Andrea and Amanda described, was designed to fill the need that the ADE had around their learning goals related to education and career planning. But I do want to point out that while the study was specifically tailored to respond to our Arizona partners' needs, this is a topic that has implications for students in schools in many different states. So in this next section of the presentation, I'm going to explain why that is the case. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into the study background and the goals of the research, and I'll describe our sample and methods before I launch into the findings. So please do use the chat feature while I'm speaking to insert any questions or comments you have, and we'll have a little bit of time to discuss those once I've run through all the findings. So what is education and career planning? Well, many states have education and career planning policies on the books, and in each state, those policies look a little bit different. So you've just heard about Arizona's ECAP policy, but Arizona is not alone in this arena. ECAP style policies exist in states as diverse as Massachusetts, Colorado, and Wisconsin, to name just a few. For our study, in the interest of working off a common definition of education and career planning, we use this definition from the US Department of Education, which states that education and career planning is a formalized process that involves high school students setting learning goals based on personal, academic, and career interest with the close support of school personnel or other individuals that can include teachers, school counselors, and parents. So you can see the kind of range of adult support that's included in that definition. Now, typically, as is the case in Arizona, the planning process results in some sort of written documentation or other artifact that's intended to follow students throughout their high school career and updated as their interests and course-taking behaviors change. So broadly, in this study, and you'll hear me use this term a lot today, we refer to these artifacts as education and career plans, or ECPs. But for those of you who are involved in this space and might know the literature around this, you may have also heard them called ILPs, or individualized learning plans. And indeed, each state has its own terminology. So to use the examples that I mentioned before, Arizona has the ECAP, in Massachusetts, it's the MyCap, in Colorado, the ICAP, and Wisconsin, the ACP. So the landscape is quite varied, and each state kind of has its own special spin on this. Well, what do we know about these policies? Research suggests that education and career planning is considered a promising intervention to help students make informed choices about life after high school. And many of these policies, as I said, have been on the books for well over a decade. You heard that Arizona's ECAP policy was instituted in 2008. And that was a period actually when a lot of states launched similar policies. Most recently, as of 2020, 34 states have mandated the use of education and career plans, including, of course, Arizona. However, despite their widespread use as a state policy, the research about the relationship between students' participation in education and career planning and their outcomes is pretty limited. Next slide, please. So to respond to our partners' needs in Arizona and to fill this gap in the national evidence base, we designed our study with several goals in mind. So using a nationally representative data set, the high school longitudinal study of 2009, which I'll explain a little bit more about on the next slide, we sought to understand first the prevalence of education and career planning as a requirement in US public high schools and the average characteristics of schools that required planning. Secondly, we sought to understand the prevalence of education and career planning as a student experience and whether participation in planning varied by student characteristics. And finally, we were interested in the student college-going behaviors associated with participation in the 3 planning elements included in Arizona's policy. And again, those are early planning, adult support, and yearly review. Next slide, please. So here's a bit more information about the data source and the sample for our study. We used a nationally representative longitudinal survey. The HLSLS surveys first-time 9th grade students who began high school in the fall of 2009. And you may ask, well, why this data set exactly? Well, the HSLS is one of several national longitudinal surveys operated by the National Center for Education Statistics. And this is actually the most recent one that has been launched. And it follows this cohort of 9th graders starting in 2009, which was right when Arizona's policy was launched. And the HSLS is actually a great source for investigating this topic because it specifically includes survey items focused on how students plan for and transition to life after high school. So we were able to take advantage of this focus to define a set of indicators of student participation in education and career planning that mirrored the Arizona policy. So the 3 core elements of early planning, adult support, and yearly review. The HSLS has completed 5 survey waves to date, the first 3 of which were used in Rel West study. And in terms of our population of interest, we were looking at students enrolled in public high schools in the first survey year, fall of 2009, and the first follow-up year corresponding to the spring of 2012, when most of them would have been enrolled in the 11th grade. And we did this because the study was based on a state policy affecting public school students. So we therefore limited our sample to students enrolled in public schools. And finally, we examined responses from that set of students who also remained in the sample at the second follow-up year, corresponding to the fall of 2013, when most of them would have graduated from high school and transitioned to post-secondary education and/or the workforce. So we can actually track them into post-secondary and/or the workforce and see what kind of behaviors they've demonstrated related to those topics. The final analytic sample resulted in about 12,600 students. Collectively, they were enrolled in about 770 schools in the base year. And this number represents the number of students who remained in the sample after accounting for attrition and non-response, which is just a fancy way of saying that some respondents dropped out of the study or were unable to be contacted by the time of the third survey wave in the fall of 2013, which is a pretty common phenomenon in large-scale longitudinal studies like these that attempt to track a lot of students over many years. One note about the numbers that you see here, the reported numbers are approximate. We're rounding these figures due to the study's use of restricted use data, and we do that to protect the confidentiality of students who are included in the study. So on this slide, I'll talk briefly about the methods that we used. And I should say that for the technically minded, we have detailed appendices that describe each of these steps, and those can be found on the publication website at the Institute of Education Sciences. So our analysis was possible because we obtained the HSLS restricted use data files, which allowed us to link student level records with school records. So we merged the student, counselor, and school leader survey responses. And counselor responses can also be considered as proxies for school level data, since one head counselor was sampled per school. In terms of our analysis methods, we use descriptive and inferential statistical approaches to analyze school and student characteristics and to develop models that predicted their college-going behaviors. Now, because this is a large-scale longitudinal data set, there was a good deal of missing data that we had to account for. Not every single student responded to every single question in the survey. And so we used multiple imputation to fill in missing values in the data. And finally, we also used NCS provided survey weights to ensure that the results were nationally representative of schools in the base year and students in all study years. So all of the results that I'm going to share with you today, you can consider them as generalizable to the full population of public high schools in the first year, the fall of 2009, and the full population of public high school students during the whole study period, 2009 through 2013. Okay, let's get into the findings. So our first research question examines schools as the unit of analysis. We wanted to know, to what extent is education and career planning required in public high schools nationwide? And on average, do schools that require planning differ from those that do not in terms of urbanicity, college going rates, student counselor ratios, grade 9 mathematics achievement, and student demographic characteristics? So our first finding was that the majority of public high school counselors reported that their schools required students to develop a combined education and career plan in school year 2009-10. In fact, 86% of all schools required some sort of education and/or career plan. The most common type of plan was this combined education and career plan at 59% of all schools. And this was followed by 21% of schools that required education plans only, and 6% that required career plans only. So only 14% of schools reported that they did not require students to develop an ECP of some kind. So compared to schools that did not require ECPs, the schools that did require them in school year 2009-10 were more likely to be rural, had larger shares of Black students on average, and larger shares of economically disadvantaged students on average. So specifically, schools that, 49% of schools that reported requiring ECPs were rural, compared to 27% of schools that did not report requiring ECPs. Black students made up 15% of average enrollments at schools that required ECPs, compared to 8% of average enrollments at schools that did not require them. And economically disadvantaged students made up 48% of average enrollments at schools that required ECPs, compared to 32% of average enrollments at schools that did not require them. Next slide, please. All right, so those were the school level findings. And our second research question examined students as the unit of analysis. So recall that the three core elements of Arizona's ECAP policy that we're interested in are early planning, adult support, and yearly review. So in this research question, we wanted to know, to what extent do public high school students participate in education and career planning in 9th grade? To what extent do they receive support from adults, such as teachers, parents, counselors? And to what extent do they engage in yearly review of their plans? And then furthermore, does participation in these three core elements vary by student characteristics, such as race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and their prior achievement? Okay, so our first finding for this research question was that the majority of students enrolled in a public high school in school years 2009-10 and 2011-12 reported participating in early planning, but fewer reported participating in adult support and yearly review. So specifically, about 62% of students reported developing an ECP in the fall of grade 9, but only 44% of students received support from an adult to do so. And only 22% of students reviewed their ECP yearly with an adult in school throughout their high school career. Now, we were also able to isolate the types of adult support that students reported receiving. The most common form of support to develop an ECP was parents at 34% of all high school students, followed by counselors at 11%, teachers at 10%, and an adult other than these individuals at 9%. 18% of students reported developing an ECP, but without any kind of adult support. And these categories were not mutually exclusive, so students could indicate as many of them as were applicable. Now, what did these participation rates look like when disaggregating the data by student characteristics? So while some differences existed between subgroups, all student subgroups followed this same pattern. Most students reported participating in early planning, but far fewer reported participating in adult support and yearly review, consistent with the trend among the full sample of students. For example, looking at Black students, 77% of students who identified as Black reported developing an ECP in grade 9, and that was the highest rate of any subgroup. But only 53% reported receiving support from an adult to develop their plan. And only 27% reported reviewing their plan with an adult in school at least once a year. And this same pattern was evident for all other examined racial ethnic groups and for students from the top and bottom quintiles of socioeconomic status and grade 9 mathematics achievement. And you can see that in this chart here. Okay, so on to our final research question. You've seen the participation rates for early planning, adult support, and yearly review. Now, this research question sought to understand to what extent participation in those elements was associated with 4 behaviors related to the transition to post-secondary education. And I'll just mention a note on the terminology here. When we say college-going behaviors, we're referring to any kind of post-secondary institution. So that includes 4-year bachelor's degree programs, 2-year associate's degree programs, and shorter-term certificate programs. So specifically, we asked, what is the relationship between public high school students' participation in the 3 core education and career planning elements of early planning, adult support, and yearly review, and the following 4 college-going behaviors: submitting the FAFSA, completing a college preparatory curriculum throughout the course of their high school career, applying to a post-secondary institution, and immediately enrolling in a post-secondary institution in the fall following their high school graduation. All right, and our first finding here was that developing an ECP in the first semester of grade 9 and also receiving support from an adult to develop that plan was associated with select outcomes depending on the source of adult support. So I'll take a moment to explain what we're seeing here on this graph. These are average probabilities and they refer to the average probability of achieving the outcome or displaying the college-going behavior that you see on the x-axis here. So academic concentration, which means completing a college preparatory curriculum, college enrollment, bachelor's degree enrollment, college application, and college enrollment again. The black bars are the averages for students who did not receive adult support, and the orange-hued bars are the averages for students who did receive adult support. So we'll start with support from a parent. Support from a parent was positively associated with completing a college prep curriculum, enrolling in any type of college, and enrolling in a bachelor's degree program specifically. So students who received support from a parent had a 6.4 percentage point higher likelihood of completing a college preparatory curriculum by the end of high school, and a 6 percentage point higher likelihood of enrolling in college, and a 3.7 percentage point higher likelihood of enrolling in a bachelor's degree program on average, compared to students who did not report receiving help from a parent to develop their ECP in grade 9. Now, other sources of adult support were also correlated with select outcomes. So receiving support from a teacher to develop an ECP in grade 9 was associated with a 4.4 percentage point higher likelihood of applying to college on average. And support from an adult other than a counselor, teacher, or parent was associated with college enrollment, but in the opposite direction. Students who reported this source of support had a 5.9 percentage point lower likelihood of college enrollment on average, and that's represented in the far right cluster of bars there. Next slide, please. All right, let's move on to the findings for yearly review. So regardless of when students reported developing their ECP, either in the fall of 2009 or in a subsequent year, students who reviewed their ECPs annually with an adult in school were more likely to submit a FAFSA, apply to college, and enroll in college compared to their peers who did not participate in yearly review. So specifically, students who participated in yearly review had a 4.6 percentage point higher likelihood of submitting the FAFSA than students who did not participate in yearly review. And yearly review was also associated with a 2.7 percentage point higher likelihood of applying to college and a 3 percentage point higher likelihood of enrolling in college on average. Now, you may have noticed that we shared findings for adult support and yearly review, but not for early planning, the first element that we identified. Well, that's because developing an ECP in grade 9 alone, without adult support or yearly reviews, was not associated with any of the 4 outcomes that we examined. In other words, we only saw evidence of completion of the college-going behaviors that we looked at when there was some sort of adult involved in the process. Now, secondly, none of the ECP elements that we examined were associated with enrolling in an associate degree or certificate program. So you saw that we found evidence that it was associated with enrollment in a bachelor's degree program, but no specific results for the other types of post-secondary institutions that we examined. And finally, the study team found no significant relationships between counselor support for developing an ECP in grade 9 and any of the college-going behaviors examined. However, I will say that a relatively low share of students, just 11%, received support from a counselor to develop their ECPs in grade 9. And with that, I will put down the mic now and hand it back to Francis to see if we've had any questions come through during the presentation of findings. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Thomas, and thanks also to Amanda and Andrea. So we did get a couple questions. One was just maybe a kind of factual question. Is the ECP part of ESSA, and is it part of college and career readiness?
Well, I'll answer that in the context of the study and the data source, which is to say that education and career planning as a policy phenomenon predates ESSA. And you're just taking the example of Arizona, Arizona's policy was instituted in 2008, and many states have also had these policies on the books for over a decade. So education and career planning as a national phenomenon has been around for quite some time now. I'm not sure the degree to which it's kind of written into ESSA policy, but it's possible that there are some provisions for that.
Okay, gotcha. So Noelle asked, does immediate enrollment mean they actually attended college?
It does, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then we have a question from Lorena. Maybe you just want to read it, Thomas, instead of me reading it out loud. Can you see the chat?
Okay, from Lorena, let's see. Okay, are you tracking including the numbers for individuals enrolling in registered apprenticeship programs, workforce training programs, etc., as part of the numbers for high school to post-secondary education enrollment? Well, the high school longitudinal study I know has some indicators for participation in apprenticeship programs. What we specifically looked at was participation in some degree granting or certificate granting post-secondary institution. So that's not to say that students who participated in those programs did not also participate in registered apprenticeship programs. It's possible it may be captured in that data element, but not exclusively so. So that would have to be kind of a separate indicator that we would track, a separate outcome that we would track.
Okay, we've got a couple questions about what support means when you talk about adult support. What are the types of conversations, and how much time does a student actually spend with an adult? That also was reflected in a question that someone DM'd to me. The low influence of counselor involvement may signal high caseloads.
And that's a great observation, and it's a great question as well. So, this is a good point to mention a couple of limitations with the data. With these large scale longitudinal studies, we're really taking a bird's eye view into some of these concepts like adult support. We can dig into kind of student responses about the frequency of adult interactions that they've had, and again, over just a very limited time period. And as you saw in the presentation, we can identify the specific types of adults that may have provided support, but sort of the substance and quality of what those conversations, what that support looked like, is really a black box with this data. And so I think it's a really good question, like what do we mean when we say adult support? And so what I would say to that is, we can only see as much as the data tells us. And so, adult support in one sense is kind of a crude measure using this data set. We can just simply see whether students said that they received adult support. We don't know what that support exactly entailed. And so, this is the part when myself as a researcher, I go to my go-to pitch that more research is needed, right? Because we need to dig into what is meant by adult support. And we need to understand what that variation looks like in different contexts. And in order to kind of tease apart the results that we see for adult support, is that just a one-off conversation that you have with a supportive mentor in school on a couple occasions throughout the school year? Or is it something more regular, perhaps something that's built into the regular structure of the school day and the master calendar? Is it embedded in classroom assignments and things of that nature? So great question. I think it's something that this data can't answer, but it's a crucial question to answer if we want to move this research forward.
Yeah, that's great.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
As that question came through too, I sometimes wonder through a student's perspective versus an adult is sometimes what we're doing as support, students don't see it as support. So it's all just based upon their lens and perspective, because we could be having those conversations. But if they're not what the student maybe wants to hear in that moment, they don't see that as support.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just, I think it all could depend on just the student perspective too, of what they believe support to be.
Yep, that's a great point, Amanda. And it also gets back to the self-reported nature of this data. So again, these are students providing their own self-reported observations about their high school experiences. So to Amanda's point, you know, a student may consider some type of interaction as support, whereas they might consider another one as not qualifying as support, right? So that's another caveat that's kind of built into this analysis.
Looks like we have a couple questions about how ECAPs have been implemented in different states. One is the practice of starting an ECAP in the 9th grade, a newer practice, whereas, you know, many high schools maybe start junior and senior year. And then secondarily, how many states required ECAP type plans around the time when Arizona was implementing its own requirement? And can we learn anything from that data?
Yeah, that's a good question. First and foremost, as I mentioned, we wanted to model this study after the Arizona policy, and this data set allowed us to do that by looking at participation in education career planning beginning in the 9th grade. But I'm not sure the extent to which that's a common feature of education and career planning policies nationwide. In regards to the question about, did this start around the other states start this around the same time as Arizona? I'm not sure about that, but Education Commission of the States has a pretty good tracker for when these kind of policies were, put into law. And I remember consulting that at one point as I was trying to get the lay of the land. So that's a resource that you all might want to look into. I'm happy to hunt that down and provide that to the person who asked the question if you want to contact me after the presentation today. But yeah, it is a very varied landscape, and each state kind of has its own parameters around what that policy looks like.
I can speak for Arizona since the state board rule in 2008, it's always been 9th grade. So 9th grade has always been our starting point, and we are having discussions about what that could look like in the future of even moving, if not all of it, portions of it down into the middle school to start this in 7th or 8th grade. But I want to make sure I'm very clear that that is not happening. These are just kind of unofficial conversations with the field and with other stakeholders.
We have an interesting question about variation between rural and urban areas. I was wondering if any of our presenters could speak to that.
Francis, is the question about variation in the outcomes between students who came from rural areas versus other settings?
I don't know. Brett, do you want to unmute and add another sentence or two to your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you found a higher percentage of students in urban areas attending post-secondary education compared to rural, or vice versa.
Oh, okay, thanks, Brett. Yeah, we did not investigate that specifically. The only element that we looked at with regard to how rural or urban the school was that first research question around the average characteristics of schools that required planning versus schools that did not. And that was where we found that the schools that required planning tended to be more rural on average. But in terms of student outcomes, it wasn't something that we specifically looked at.
We also have a question about how was the military accounted for? We know military enlistment can lead to both education and career outcomes.
Yeah, another great question, and another one that unfortunately was outside of the scope of the study. But back to just the richness of this data set, I know that the high school longitudinal study does track military enlistment, and it's just one of many variables that are available. And in fact, this is also something that I could follow up with folks on if they want to contact me after the call. We use the restricted use data for the HSLS, but many of the kind of descriptive analyses about the data can be done publicly on the IES kind of public dashboard where they present some of this data. So there are some interesting kind of questions around post-secondary enrollment and education and career outcomes associated with military enlistment that may be available there. And I'm happy to point people in that direction to answer questions like that.
Great. We have some other interesting questions that I would say are good things to talk about, probably beyond the scope of the study about how do we better support parents, particularly maybe immigrant parents or people who haven't participated in post-secondary education, to have these kind of important conversations. And maybe that's something we can get into in the breakouts. I mean, I'm sure there's a range of people here who have experience trying that out in your LEAs. Do we have any other? Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to highlight too what Robin put in the chat about the State Leaders of Career Development Network meetings. And so a lot of this is discussed in those meetings, that kind of those further questions and implications about the research. So she put a link in there. I think a lot of the questions that people are asking, we really kind of dive into those and see examples from a lot of other states and what's working for them.
That's great. Yeah. And just a reminder, we'll also send out everyone, the presenters' contact info after this if you want to dig in about more questions. Or I know, Amanda, you said you'd love to hear from folks who could use more support.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for those conversations. And I see in the Padlet that we already have some suggestions and statements. And before we, so you can review those now. And is there anything that any of you want to share from what you discussed that's particularly you think helpful or insightful?
Well, this is Marianne. I'd say one thing is that for us in Virginia, the things that we've discussed today, those are in our standards of accreditation. And so school board has bought into it, and our school divisions, it's part of their accreditation. And again, that standard, having it written down in the standards, I think makes a difference. It's sort of like if you write it down and the school board says this is what needs to happen, it's more likely to happen. It's just sometimes not with everyone.
So making it policy is a critical piece in your experience.
Yes.
Thank you for that.
I'll speak for my group. The one thing that came up from a couple different people, Randy, that it needs to be a focus and priority for the entire school and a school-wide initiative, not just for one person to handle or one department, but really making it part of the school culture and kind of just part of daily activities with students.
Yeah, I see that written up here. I don't know if that was a different group or your group, but people were saying not only do we need more counselors, but we need more people across all campuses to be engaged.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think when you cross-pollinate, so there's nothing wrong with an English teacher having an assignment that relates to something with a career, and a history teacher or the chemistry teacher, everybody kind of on board in a school. So youngsters begin to see how important the academics are to their choices.
The other thing I see here is outreach. So as some people call it, intrusive outreach, right? Like don't wait for students to come to you, but reach out to students. And that again is the argument for having lots of people involved throughout the whole campus. This is interesting too. one group or one participant here contracts with a parent training organization. And so that sort of more formally engages parents. And I know in our conversation, and I bet in others, people have talked about the importance of bringing parents into meetings, sort of in person, or in recent years, Zoom, but to engage them in these discussions so that the parent and the teacher and the student are all together reviewing coursework and planning for future coursework and identifying themes and interests.
One thing that was mentioned in our group, and I've been doing this a long time and I never thought of this idea, and I think it's brilliant. Tara talked about, yes, pushing it out to our classrooms and our teachers helping, but I never thought about breaking out the 4-year plan by department. So having English teachers just talk to students about the English options that are available, you know, in the different levels, having math teachers just talk about what that math sequence can be as part of that 4-year plan. That's something that as a practitioner, our school counseling department always, you know, led the lessons and the development on that, but I never thought about breaking it down that detailed into department where, you know, science teachers would just talk to them about that and then they would fill out that part of their 4-year plan. I never thought about that. And I think that's genius because that's where the teachers are comfortable talking about that, because sometimes they don't want to participate because they say, I don't know if I know what they're going to ask me. I'm uncomfortable talking about post-high school stuff, but they could talk to them about science options all day long that are available at the high school. So I'm going to definitely take that back to our counselors here as we continue professional development in this area.
Well, I'm noting the time and we have just about 5 minutes left. So I want to pass this over to Francis and thank you all for your deep engagement in this. I feel like we could have another 45 minutes of a discussion. And we hope that this at least will get people kind of started on different ways of thinking about how to engage parents and how to enrich the college and career planning.
Thank you all very much. Happy to connect with anyone who wants to reach out to me after you get my contact information. Thanks for joining today.